Hello and welcome to WinZone Focus. I'm Davina William. This week on the program, Kiwi Ian McCormick shares his story of survival after being left for dead on a remote beach in the Indian Ocean. And we hear from a Middle East specialist about the increasing number of violent attacks against Christians. Despite any hopes of the so-called Arab Spring easing religious tension across the Middle East, the last 2 years have brought the highest reported number of attacks against Christians, according to several international organizations which publish watch lists of countries where discrimination takes place. But journalist Raymond Ibrahim says that despite the reported upsurge in violence, widespread anti-Christian sentiment is not new, but has historical basis, as he explained to Allan Lee.
If you study history as I have, that's my original, focus and discipline of study, and I mean the primary historical sources, there are the same things that you'll see happening today. But there was a little gap because there was an aberration historically, which I call and others call the golden age for Christians. And this occurred during the colonial era and even a little bit in the post-colonial era. I say between 1850 to 1950, because the Western powers became so dominant over the Islamic world. So many Muslims westernized, just because, as Osama bin Laden correctly said, people by nature favor the strong horse. And a natural byproduct of that is, of course, life became pretty good for Christians because they were no longer really ostracized from their faith. And so this really went on until, this is my thesis and my theory, until basically the 60s and 70s. And now, as the West liberalized and became decadent and morally licentious and apologetic about itself and hating its own Christian heritage and its own history, all of those things, far from attracting Muslims, like as earlier when the West was dominant, actually repulsed Muslims and caused them to go back to their way. And so what we're seeing right now, especially the persecution of Christians, is just it's a continuation of what happened yesterday. And now we're in that age of where Muslims have contempt for Western culture. And so, of course, the natural repercussions and consequences are things like terrorism against infidels, which, of course, also have a historical lineage, attacks on Christians, and any number of things.
We've seen the Arab Spring over the last couple of years. And we've seen leaderships across the Middle East topple, people like Colonel Gaddafi. Often these are people who are dictators. That can't be bad to lose people like that, can it?
Well, it's interesting that you say, and you're absolutely right, because there's a correlation between dictatorship and Islamist, jihadis, Sharia, and all that. But again, I think it's presented in the wrong way. I think the mainstream narrative is that there's these dictators, and because we're Western societies, we know dictators are bad. We think democracies are great. We think that that's why there's violence and frustration and chaos. It's because there's a dictator. So the people are frustrated, they're oppressed, they wish to free themselves from the yoke of this dictator. But if you really study the history of the Islamic world, you're going to find that dictators do not create these societies, but rather these societies create dictators. So let's look at Iraq. Saddam Hussein, he was, of course, in the media portrayed as a terrible human being. And of course, he did commit any number of atrocities. But once you took him out of the picture, what happened in Iraq? It's not like all of a sudden people became happy, liberal, secular, and learned to get along. What happened is a humongous civil war. Everyone just attacked everyone, Sunnis and Shias and Kurds fighting each other, with, of course, Christians right in the middle being the first targets. On the topic of Christian persecution, in just the last 10 years since the Iraq war, more than half of the indigenous population's either gone or dead because they were immediately attacked once Saddam Hussein was taken out of the picture. So you find that when you get rid of these guys, it's just total chaos because all these groups just go right at each other because each one doesn't want democracy. Each one of these groups wants to be the dominant one. And that's why in the end you do get a dictator. And if anything, he tries to keep a lid on this, and this is what Assad is doing.
This must have happened relatively recently. I was working in the Middle East 20 odd years ago, and I was working with Palestinian Christians and Palestinian Muslims, and they seemed to get along fine. There was no sense of animosity at all. So has it changed markedly in the last 15, 20 years?
Oh, it has definitely changed. Every decade, like I pointed out, my family came from Egypt. They're, Christian Copts. When they were young, let's say in the 40s and the 50s, they didn't know about any of this. They didn't see it. It wasn't really happening because, again, that is that golden age. That's the last end of the golden age where there was just people didn't really, pinpoint them out. Oh, you're Christians, this and that, because Muslims themselves were pretty liberalized. And then decade after decade, it just got worse. So in the 70s, it became a lot worse. And this is, of course, 70s, you have the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and et cetera. 80s got worse, 90s worse. And now it's just right now in the Islamic world, there's areas, especially where there's a big Christian population, that are just completely under attack. And Nigeria comes to my mind, where, a Sunday doesn't pass without an attack on a church, at least one, and dead Christians.
It's hard, though, for Christians, isn't it? Because we are told to turn the other cheek. Our way is the way of peace, and so that would put us really on the back foot, wouldn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And not only that, though, I think it confuses so many Western people, even non-Christians. But if you live in the West and there's this sort of Christian heritage, this kind of Christian epistemology background, and in your mind, religion is Christianity, and Christianity is a spiritual thing. It separates between state and church. It doesn't really have any laws about what to do other than just, like you said, turn the other cheek, try to forgive, be tolerant. So I think that's one of the biggest pitfalls, is a lot of Westerners project those views onto Muslims. And of course, this is a very secular worldview that does not take into account the singular differences of religion. So, these very antithetical teachings are obviously having ramifications and echoes down the centuries.
I saw an article you wrote in which you said that the persecution of Christians was the Achilles heel of Islam. What did you mean by that?
What I mean by that is it's the Achilles heel, or the ultimate weakness for Islam's image in the West. And the reason I say that is because Islamic violence directed towards, let's say, Israel or the West will always be articulated easily by the mainstream media as a product of grievance. They're oppressed, they're ostracized, and this is just, they're frustrated, so that's why they're lashing out. But then when you come to this issue of Christian persecution under Islam, this justification or rationalization no longer works, because now Muslims are in the majority. It's their countries where they make the majorities. You have Islamic governments. And, then you have Christian populations. Sometimes they're as little as 1%. And all they want to do is go to church. They have no political influence, or disenfranchised, or ostracized, or second-class citizens. And they just want to go to church. And then the church gets bombed, or they get attacked and beat, and their women get abducted and raped and forced to convert to Islam, et cetera, et cetera. So that narrative, I don't think the mainstream media has a way to justify it, because now Muslims are attacking people who are weaker than them, who are of the same often race, the same ethnicity, the same names, the same backgrounds. There's no political territorial dispute. The hostility is first and foremost a product of religious intolerance. I mean, most people forget that what we call the Islamic world in the 7th century, most of that territory was part of the Christian world. And that in the 7th century, half of the entire world's Christian population lived in what we call the Arab world, specifically from Morocco to Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Turkey, of course. These were all Christian regions. As I wrote for that one article about all over around the Islamic world, Christians are fleeing. And even that has a historical parallel, because there were a lot of those Christians who converted. Then there were a few who maintained their religious identities and became what's called a dhimmi, like a third-class citizen who accepts it just so he can maintain his religion. And then a lot of them fled, and that's exactly what's happening right now.
Well, Raymond, it's been fascinating to talk to you today. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Middle East journalist Raymond Ibrahim talking there with Allan Lee. Still to come, from death to life, the extraordinary story of Ian McCormack is next.
And that he does healing miracles now, today.